Hello, everyone. We will start the webinar soon. Just wait a few seconds to let everybody in, and then we get started. So I think we can get started now. So first of all, good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for joining today. My name is Carolina Lisboa. I'm a manager on the Agricultural Innovation team at Verra, and I will be your host today. Today's webinar will introduce the new VCS rice methodology, VM0051, Improved Management for Rice Production Systems. Before we begin, let's go over some housekeeping items. This section will last approximately 60 minutes. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar, less than about 10 minutes. Please submit your questions using the Q&A option in the Zoom panel. The webinar will be recorded and available on the Verra website and YouTube channel. And as the speakers today, we're gonna have Sammy Osman and Anna from ATOA and myself. Here is what we're gonna cover today. We start with introduction and give you a brief overview of the topic. And then we move to a motivation section where we tell you why this methodology is important. Then we move to the methodology contents and methods to introduce to you the key components and the structure of the methodology. Then we move to a final remarks to summarize and let you know the next steps. And then we will close with a Q&A section. And you have some time to send us questions, and we will answer some of them live. So let's start with the introduction. So now let's take a look on the VM0051, Improved Management in Rice Production Systems, which is a new methodology released under the Verified Carbon Program, the VCS, by Verra. This methodology focuses on the projects implementing improved water and crop management practices in flooded rice systems, specifically to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. By applying these practices, rice producers can help mitigate their environmental impact and contribute to global emission reduction efforts. The methodology was developed by Verra in consultation with ATOA Carbon and underwent expert assessment by 3 external experts. You can find their related detailed report on the methodology in the methodology webpage. The new methodology, VCS methodology, is based on the latest scientific principles, ensuring that the greenhouse gas emission reductions are accurately quantified. This is a comprehensive and robust approach, enhancing the credibility of emission reduction projects in rice production. Finally, wider adoption of this methodology will improve emission reductions estimates and strengthen the overall credibility and integrity of rice-related projects globally. Now let's move to the motivation, why we developed this methodology. This methodology, VM51, was driven by several important factors. First, rice is the primary source of food for more than half of the global population, and it's cultivated over 106.8 million hectares worldwide. Given this scale and importance, improving rice cultivation practices can have a significant impact on global sustainability. However, rice fields are also one of the largest sources of methane emissions in agriculture, which is a potent greenhouse gas contributing to climate change. This creates an urgent need for a solution to reduce emissions for rice production. In March 2023, Verra inactivated the use of the UNFCCC CDM rice methodology, which focused on the methane emissions reductions through adjusted water management practices in rice cultivation. This produce was driven by concern about this methodology and its projects, highlighting the need of a more robust approach. VM51 was developed to address these concerns and ensure alignment with the latest scientific understanding and advancements in rice greenhouse gas accounting. This methodology also aims to align with the Integrated Council for Voluntary Carbon Management, which will help to secure core carbon principles labeling for projects implementing it. Ultimately, the goal is to scale the implementation of climate-friendly rice management practices that can reduce emissions while ensuring global food security and generate significant socioeconomic benefits. Now let's go over some of the key features of VM51. We start with the safeguards for soil organic carbon losses. The methodology includes safeguards designed to avoid soil organic carbon loss that could occur to the implementation of project activities. This ensures that projects does not unintentionally harm the soil health while reducing emissions. The second one is the monitoring and quantification of emissions. A critical aspect of the VM51 is the requirement to monitor and quantify nitrous oxide emissions, which is also a potent greenhouse gas. It also requires the quantification of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel and energy consumption, ensuring a comprehensive approach to greenhouse gas accounting. The third one is a dynamic baseline setting. The methodology uses a dynamic baseline setting approach, which accounts for the potential impact of actual weather conditions. This makes this assessment more adaptable to a variety of environmental conditions and ensures a more accurate emission reduction estimates. The first one is the expanded guidance for project area certification. The VM51 provides expanded guidance for project area certification, which helps in accurately identify different cultivation patterns within the project area. It also includes detailed guidance on quantifying emission reductions specific to these areas, making the methodology more precise. The fifth is the flexible approach. The methodology offers flexible approach for quantification, allowing the use of biogeochemical model for emission reduction estimates. This flexibility helps adapt the methodology to different project needs and increase its applicability across various systems and conditions. The last one is best practice for guidance using digital monitoring. VM51 includes best guidance for using digital monitoring, reporting, and verification tools. These include leveraging like remote sensing and machine learning to streamline the validation and verification of project data, ensuring greater accuracy and efficiency. These key features make VM51 a robust and scientifically sound approach for addressing emissions from rice cultivation, while ensuring that projects are both flexible and scalable. So now, without further ado, we start passing over to the speakers. The first speaker today is Anna. Anna, the floor is yours.
Hi, Carolina, and everyone. Thank you very much. So the sources for this methodology, two of the sources for the development of the methodology are the CDM methodology previously mentioned, which is the methodology for methane emission reduction by adjusted water management practice and rice cultivation, as well as VM42, which is the agriculture methodology under the VCS program. Projects that seek credits for soil organic carbon stock increases or removals, employ practices that may result in material declines in soil organic carbon, or implement changes in management practice off-seas changes must use VM42 and cannot use just this methodology. So some of the important definitions to know for today and just in general about this methodology. So AWD is a system of cultivating integrated lowland rice using controlled and intermittent irrigation cycles according to a periodic drainage and reflooding schedule. In addition to the end of season drainage. Just to note that this definition has been updated based on feedback from stakeholders during the stakeholder consultation process to provide context rather than technical prescriptive guidance. The methodology does provide guidance that the usage of a local expert should be employed to provide that kind of prescriptive technical guidance when it comes to implementing AWD for project and region specific scenarios. Other definitions that are important are controlled irrigation, which is a type of water management where the project has irrigated systems in place that allow for controlled management of the water regime. And then the cultivation pattern, which is a set of activities and machinery operations used to cultivate rice in the project area. This requires describing quantitative and qualitative details related to the implementation of the project activities and management practices. I'm now going to turn it over to Sammy, who will continue on.
Thanks, Anna. Yes, hi guys, Sammy Osman from ATOA Carbon. Thanks for joining us. So I'll take a few more slides and then hand back to Anna. So in terms of applicability, we have seen some changes in this methodology, some significant changes relative to the AMS3AU methodology. One important change is that we've identified some main project activities, in particular those that drive improved irrigation management activities focused on methane reduction. So every project must include at least one of several main project activities, AWD, DSR, and I think there's shorter irrigation, changes in the irrigation duration. Projects are then able, if they like, to include optional additional project activities on top of those. And we've got a few examples here. Methanotrophs for the first time is explicitly included in a methodology, which is great. Nitrogen management, which is pretty straightforward, included in some of the other methods out there. Biochar, and then there's some other examples in the methodology. And again, main project activities are mandatory for all projects, and you can also then add one or more of these other exciting new options. Controlled drainage, irrigation and drainage is absolutely critical. That's at the heart of what we're talking about here, the main project activities. Another interesting new applicability condition is that projects must maintain the same number of rice cultivation seasons from their baseline to project. This was essentially because we weren't able to comprehensively look at land use change associated with moving from 3 seasons to 2 or 1 to 3, etc. And then there's some programmatic requirements here, which we refer specifically to the VCS standard. Some of the requirements included in the method, such as no clearing of native ecosystems within the last 10 years, which you should all be familiar with. We go to the next slide. And then at the bottom of the applicability list, we also have some no-nos. So in this case, management practices that decrease carbon inputs to soils are not allowed under this methodology because we want to make sure we carefully avoid potential soil organic carbon losses. Upland, rain-fed, deep water, non-irrigated lowlands rice, none of those are included, just the same as they were excluded under some of the previous methodologies. And then another new one is projects changing off-season management practices is also not allowed, except for what we mentioned here, which are some of the scaling factors. You are allowed to change how you handle rice straw. You can change the levels of burning, for example, and then obviously your irrigation changes are allowed. Other than that, no significant off-season changes like bringing livestock onto the project where they weren't there before, etc. And we can move to the next slide. That'd be great. Project boundary, pretty straightforward as you'd expect. Soil methanogenesis, methane coming from soils is the absolute main focus area. So that is included. Fossil fuels, liming, if there are significant changes that result in non-de minimis changes in emissions, then those must be included, otherwise they're optional. Nitrogen fertilizers and other nitrogen inputs such as rice straw in particular. So those are included, and there's a couple of mechanisms in the methodology which we'll get into in a moment in future slides, which go through the mechanisms as to how we must account for those. But those are critical that we account for those. And then optionally, if there's a nitrogen rate reduction or a use of enhanced efficiency fertilizers or nitrification inhibitors, etc., projects have the option to seek emission reduction credits for those. So that's optional. And then down the bottom, biomass burning. If there are material changes in the volumes of biomass being burnt, then that very well could be a significant impact and you should include it. Otherwise, if there aren't major changes, then the project could opt to leave that out. And yeah, I think that's it for this slide. We could go to the next one. Excellent, thank you. So in terms of baseline scenario, there's a really nice detailed table in the methodology which we've replicated here. Before I get into that, it's worth also mentioning that this methodology, this methodology does allow for variable baselines, and this was specifically in response to addressing some useful feedback from ICVCM. And essentially what that means is that what we expect to be the norm is that there's conventional flooding in each project's baseline. That's how most of the other methodologies out there were built. This methodology does allow some flexibility though. So if we see some parts of the project that did single drainage in their baseline, then that would be allowed. And that project would be, that field, that farm would be using single drainage as their baseline. We've also conservatively essentially required that if you have an instance of single drainage in your 3-year minimum historical look-back period, your minimum 3-year baseline, then you would have to use single drainage for your entire baseline. So that's to make sure that we're conservatively accounting for those instances. Other than that, going back to the slide here, you see there's a good level of guidance and detail in the methodology with respect to all of the critical parameters for which each project must gather data. So I won't go through these, but you can see water regime is absolutely critical. Then there's a few other ones such as preparation of the field, tillage, etc. Nitrogen is absolutely critical. What sort of treatment for the straw in particular? There's a couple of those extra optional amendments, and then there's a few other CO2 ones down the bottom, which may or may not be de minimis and necessary for projects. I think that's it, and we can move on to the next slide. In terms of additionality, for this methodology, a project method is prescribed, and the method tracks very closely with the requirements in the new VCS additionality tool. There's a link there to that. Hopefully you've all seen it. And there are multiple layers with respect to demonstrating additionality: regulatory surplus, barrier analysis or investment analysis, and then a common practice analysis. And for this specific methodology, a 20% penetration rate threshold has been adopted. And you'll see that's similar to VM42, so you should be familiar with how that works. Another very useful element here is that we've responded to stakeholder feedback with respect to how difficult it can be sometimes to obtain official government data or statistics on historical practices. So a little bit hard to demonstrate additionality in some contexts. So here we've got multiple more flexible sources for data that you can draw on specifically for your additionality requirements. Government data, peer-reviewed literature, independent research data, attestations from experts in the field, including, for example, IRI agronomists, grower surveys, and very usefully remote sensing data sets as well. So making it very clear that there's flexible options here and hopefully that provides the project enough opportunity to bring robust data to bear. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. So in terms of quantification, there's three main options here that projects can employ, and a mix of options potentially. So there's the first of them is modeling. So quantification approach one is modeling. Now, for this methodology, there's a fairly light touch in terms of the guidance that's provided. And the reason for that is Verra has very extensive best-in-class guidance on calibrating, validating, process for using independent experts to ensure that the model is sufficiently set up to model the particular type of project you're looking at. That guidance is contained in VM53, and there's also really great guidance in VM42. So to a large extent in this RICE methodology, essentially points back to those two methods with a little bit of extra guidance to make sure that, hey, look, we're talking about RICE systems here. So the most critical drivers will be your irrigation changes, how much biomass gets fed to the soil. So when you're setting up your model using VMD53 and VM42, make sure you pay particularly close attention to those factors that we've identified that are critical for RICE. Other than that, the vast majority of the guidance is going to be in those two documents. Any SSRs that cannot be modeled must be covered by defaults, which is pretty obvious. So two good examples are CO2 from liming, which I think most models don't necessarily handle, and then fossil fuels. So if you employ modeling, great, but there will probably be SSRs or parts of your project for which you still need a default approach, and we've given a couple of examples there. We could go to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. And the next two options are quantification option 2 is direct measurements using flux chamber measurements, and quantification option 3 is my personal favorite, default emission factors. So for QA2, essentially this method prescribes flux chamber measurements and chromatography analysis in laboratories essentially. So it requires field measurements at baseline control sites, as well as field measurements in project scenario. There's some very detailed guidance, which we'll refer to later in terms of how to go about stratifying, how to set up your chamber measurements, what type of instance, how many types of samples, etc. There's a lot of guidance on that, QA/QC, etc. It's compulsory for projects to use QA2 in a few specific scenarios. If you're using methanotrophs on your project, if you're using biochar on your project, if you're using low emission rice varieties, or if you're using AWD and you only drain to a depth of less than 10 centimeters, so you drain it to 6 centimeters, for example, then you have to use QA2. You've got no other option. Otherwise, QA2 is also optional for AWD, DSR, etc. And then again, the same with modeling. There'll be SSRs or sources, sinks, and reservoirs that can't be directly measured. Fossil fuels, for example, we're only looking at methane here. Then you would use the default emission factors to account for those other emission profiles. Lastly, QA3, which is the default emission factors. So this methodology allows for a flexible approach for projects with a capacity limit of 60 kilotons a year, 60,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. Projects of that size are able to use tier 1 emission factors, essentially pulling from the IPCC emission factors. Projects at capacity limits above 60 kilotons a year have a number of flexible options where you would need more accurate emission factors, essentially, country specific, etc. And then there's extensive guidance in the methodology for how to go about sourcing both the IPCC tier 1 and then the high tier emission factors. I think we can move to the next slide. This here is just a summary of the 3 quantification approaches that we discussed and which of those could be used depending on which source of greenhouse gas you're looking at. And we've covered this in detail. This table's in the methodology, so I won't go through it in detail here, but this just summarizes essentially which options are available where. Sometimes, as you'll see, there's multiple options. We'll move to the next slide. And we'll go back to Anna now. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sammy. So as part of quantification of reductions, an uncertainty deduction must be taken. So the uncertainty analysis approaches are based on the approaches included in VM42 and VMD53, as Sammy said. VM53 has a lot of guidance on the usage of models, including the uncertainty requirements. So for QA1 modeling for the uncertainty deduction, the guidance can be found there, and as well as VM42. The uncertainty deductions for QA1 modeling should focus on model prediction error, sampling error, and measurement error. An analytical calculation of error propagation is one method, as well as the Monte Carlo simulation. Project proponents must follow the guidance in VMD 53, section 861 of VM42 with respect to uncertainty calculations while using modeling under quantification approach 1. For QA2 direct measurement, the uncertainty deduction is focused on the sampling error and measurement error, and should utilize baseline data and the equations listed, which are numbers 35 and 36, and again are based on guidance from VM42. Next slide, please. So for quantification approach 3, which is default emission factors, where a tier 1 emission factor is used, projects with a capacity limit of 60,000 tons CO2e per year, you must use a default 15% uncertainty deduction. Projects with a capacity limit of over 60,000 can derive uncertainty estimates from source literature or calculate using the analytical calculation of error propagation and Monte Carlo simulation, which can both be found in information related to uncertainty for QA1 as well as in VM42. Project proponents may derive country-specific emission factors using literature or following the guidance to derive tier 2 emission factors from the IPCC guidelines. Uncertainty estimates must be derived from the source literature, otherwise calculated in accordance with the above guidance for estimating uncertainty using analytical calculations of error propagation or Monte Carlo simulation. Project proponents must use the available emission factor that results in the most conservative reduction estimate when applied across both the baseline and project scenarios. Uncertainty for fossil fuel and liming default emission factors that are expected to be lower than 10%, and so they're conservatively excluded from uncertainty calculations. The biomass burning is also excluded. Next slide, please. And I'm passing it back to Sammy for this one.
Okay, thanks, Anna. I don't have too much detail to go through here, but essentially what we see in the leakage requirements here match very closely with what we have in VM42. So quite comprehensive and hopefully familiar to a lot of you. So there's 3 separate mechanisms by which we need to account for leakage in this methodology. The first of them focuses in on new applications of organic amendments from outside of the project area. So one example would be if you brought some compost in from your neighbor's farm and you put it out over your project, you would need to account for that in terms of leakage where you hadn't done that type of practice historically. Secondly, in terms of rice yield. So I think, what's hopefully very obvious here is that we're trying to enhance the productivity of rice systems and or address greenhouse gas emissions flux. But we absolutely will not be encouraging practices that result in significant declines in rice yield, because it's just too important for the planet. So here we have a mechanism that requires us to look at yields. If they do go down, it's not the end of the world. You have an opportunity to normalize those declines relative to your neighbors. In other words, if there's a significant weather change that results in a lower yield, it's not your fault, it's not due to the project. There's mechanisms there to account for it. But in essence, if there is a material drop due to specifically your project, then there will be a penalty applied in terms of leakage, and you will get less emission reduction credits. And essentially encouraged to address those concerns. Lastly, the diversion of biomass residues used for bioenergy applications pre-project. So for those of you that have been tracking the development of this method, you will know that there is specific guidance with respect to what happens if you don't burn rice straw and you send it somewhere else. Well, that's separate to what we're describing here. There's guidance in the methodology that allows you to track the implications of you moving your biomass around. But what we're focused on here is that if there was, if you were historically sending rice straw off to make bioenergy, and then all of a sudden you stopped and you did something else fantastic with it, great. However, you would need to account for that lost supply of biomass that was previously coming from your project. So there's 3 separate leakage mechanisms here. It should be familiar to anybody who's used to our favorite VM42. And then as is the case in VM42, if any of those sources, the GHG impact of those sources are de minimis, then they can be ignored. In other words, if it's less than 5% of your total reductions of the project, then you can choose to exclude accounting for those. You would have to just demonstrate that it's de minimis, but otherwise you could exclude it. That's it, and I think we'll pass it back to my friend Anna. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Amy. So now on monitoring. So monitoring section provides a lot of guidance on sourcing data. Specifically, box 1 includes details on the selection of preferred sources, but the section also includes guidance for different activities implemented by the project. There are specific data requirements for the baseline, which is on slide 14 that Sammy went over. And it's really for the minimum specifications for identification of agricultural land management, ALM practices in the rice production systems. Projects, where possible, should employ digital monitoring, reporting, and verification tools, DMRV tools, which Carolina mentioned. In particular, remote sensing to enable efficient third-party validation and verification project data. Projects also must meet the requirements in section 319 of the VCS standard with respect to environmental impacts. So keep in mind some examples of potential negative impacts would be harm to migratory bird populations associated with the reduction in winter flooding and any challenges associated with the introduction of GMOs. Next slide, please. Thanks. So some data requirements for additionality for monitoring. We wanted to have flexibility. I think it's more important to understand that the flexibility in monitoring is important. We understood based on a lot of feedback from the consultation that it can be really difficult to meet the requirements for smallholder rice farmers where there is often not enough or no data. So it's more practical for us to have flexibility and still have robust methods in this methodology. So again, those baseline data requirements can be found in the table listed on slide 14, but the monitoring section does specify the data requirements for additionality, which are listed on this slide. There are a lot, so I won't list them all. Go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So the appendices in this methodology are really important, especially appendices 1 and 2. This is where the majority of the data for direct measurement in terms of guidance and requirements can be found. Examples are suitable methane analysis equipment and techniques, so specifications and guidance on that, as well as minimum experience requirements for staff performing key roles, minimum requirements for stratification, sample, plan, and design, any of the QA, QC for flux measurements, as well as the specifications on accreditations for laboratories. All of that can be found in Appendix 1 and 2 for QA2 direct measurement. And I restated it a second time just because this is probably the most important piece of this appendices. So there's a lot of guidance for QA/QC in these first two. next slide, please? Thanks. So Appendix 4 is not mandatory, but it does, as I mentioned, include information on DMRV, which is encouraged, not required, but strongly encouraged, particularly remote sensing to efficiently enable third-party validation and verification project data. There's also extensive QA, QC guidance and best practices for using DMRV for this methodology. All right, I think I will turn it back over to Carolina.
Great. Thank you very much, Sammy and Anna, for this insightful overview. And now, as we move forward, I would like to share some final remarks with you. So the VM51 provides a credible pathway for project proponents to achieve emission reductions while generating high-quality verified carbon units. This methodology offers a scientifically robust and flexible approach, ensuring that emission reductions are accurately quantified and verifiable. In addition, Verra has already submitted the VM51 for approval under the ICVCM CCP assessment framework and for inclusion in the ATOA COSIA eligible emission units program, further enhancing the credibility and market acceptance of projects using the methodology. Verra also encouraged proponents to utilize the digital version of the methodology, which will soon be available to streamline project implementation and ensure more efficient monitoring and reporting. Looking forward, Verra also plans to explore the possibility for adaptation of VM51 into the new Verra Scope 3 standard program, which is, by the way, open for public consultation. You are welcome to provide feedback also for the Scope 3 program. So now it's time for Q&A section. And we are happy to answer your questions. I see we have a number of questions here already on the Q&A section. So let's start with this one here. If a drainage during the 3-year baseline period was due to adverse weather conditions or drought, would the project still need to assume the baseline practice as a single drainage per season? Sammy, would you like to answer this question?
Yes, however, I wasn't paying attention. I was looking at the written question. Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
If a drainage during the 3-year baseline period was due to adverse weather condition, would the project still need to assume baseline practice as a single drainage?
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Which is conservative. It is definitely, but yeah, I think that's the pretty straightforward answer. You want me to elaborate, or we can leave it at that?
You can elaborate if you want to.
I don't know if I can sensibly. So in essence, we have seen these types of challenges in different parts of the world start to creep in more and more. The government doesn't switch on the water, or there's less water, or climatic conditions push for a change. So the method doesn't ask you to explain it, or it doesn't give you any flexibility in terms of how you handle it, other than allowing you to still be eligible. So it doesn't matter what the cause is, you're still eligible, but to be very conservative, you're forced to adopt that single drainage as your entire baseline.
Great, thank you, Sammy. There's another one here. I think you can also help answer this one. Is it compulsory to record the farmer management data for crop other than rice in cropping systems, if any?
Great question. Theoretically, no. Theoretically, you need to focus in on your rice system. So I don't know that we're going to expect cropping with rice at the same time as other crops. So most likely you're talking about the intervening season. So in theory, no, you don't need to worry about it. In practice, sometimes verifiers like to see a continuous picture, especially if you're not just doing one season, you're coming back for 2 and you're coming back year after year. So you might want to capture your basic data just to show that it's there. But in essence, the only things that need to be absolutely tracked in between seasons are two things: the volume of biomass, in particular the volume of biomass for soil, in particular rice straw, but then also your irrigation changes, because we have the IPCC scaling factors, which include irrigation pre-season. And then I think, yeah, so you would need to sort of show what you did with your biomass from your previous season, what you did with your water management in between. Those are mandatory. Other than that, strictly speaking, no, but if it's easy to capture, it might make your verifier happier.
Yeah, I just want to add some clarification here. Yes, theoretically you would not, but keep in mind that you have to ensure, as a part of applicability conditions, that there will be no change in off-season practices. Then, therefore, it's important to record and have evidence to prove this information. The next question is, can the Q&A be uploaded on the Verra website? Help, for instance, clarifications would help. Yeah, we will try that and see if that's possible. The next question is, most secondary activities, such as the use of methanotrophs, be developed in the same field as a main project activity, for example, AWD, or can a majority of project fields implement a main project activity and a smaller portion of fields implement a secondary activity? Sam, you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, the way the method's written is that each project must contain both. The method doesn't actually prescribe that every single field must contain both. So I think you would have to use your own judgment and then make sure, you know, you liaise with the VCS team and yeah. So for example, if you had one single field of AWD and absolutely everything else was just methanotrophs or something other wild and exciting, that might not fly, but some sort of blend hopefully would be acceptable.
The next question is there any minimum drying period in the single drainage system? I can answer that. The methodology does not prescribe a minimal drying period. That must be defined by the expert, which is required by the methodology to define what's the minimal period that the field should be dry to ensure methane reductions. The other question is, do you have any recommendation for process-based models that can be used under the approach 1? The methodology also does not recommend specific models. It's a job of the project proponent to ensure that the model is well calibrated and validated to be used in their specific project area. So see, Steph, maybe you can see some other questions you want to reply. Can there be a project with single drainage without AWD or DSR plus any optional activities? That's the easy one. Sam, you want to answer?
Yes. So if you're going from conventional flooding to single drainage, I think yes is the answer. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, you must implement at least one of the main project activities, and you can optionally implement another one in the same area. But every area of your project must have at least one of the main project activities implemented. I hope that's helped to clarify. In the gas testing using chambers only for sample fields, as there are not enough revenue for carbon credits to cover the cost of gas testing. I'm not sure if I really understand these questions, but yeah, you have also other two quantification approaches under the methodology. If the project does not have enough resource, it might be eligible to use perhaps quantification approach 1 or 2, which does not require field measurements. How many chambers are required per field for direct measurements? At least 3 reference fields are required per stratum. Sam, you want to answer?
I mean, you answered your own question there, which is great. So yeah, the method requires at least 3 instances of baseline control sites and then 3 projects per strata. So if you only had 1 stratum, that's very exciting, well done, then you would still need 6 separate sample locations, and then you need 3 replicates each time you go out. You would take a sample, take a break, take another one, take a break, take another one. So that means at least 6 times 3 equals 18, at least 18 samples per stratum each time you go out there, so weekly. Hopefully that answers the question. But there's an appendix dedicated to all of that type of guidance. It tells you, how to build a chamber, QA/QC for your measurement tech, expertise required, and it gets into how many samples are needed. It also talks about time of day, etc. So there's really good level of detail in the appendix that addresses those and related questions.
Thank you, Sammy. The next question is, for both baseline and project sites, 6 chambers will be installed. Is there a specific requirement for their placement, such as side by side or a particular distance apart? Yes, that's the methodology does not give any guidance or specific guidance on that. It's again another topic that must follow the expert recommendations to install the chambers in the field, but it must follow the principle of randomly sampling. With that said, I think that's clarified the point about.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add one more thing, Carol. So there is one extra requirement in the method that talks about making sure you sample all of your samples in that given strata within a specific time frame. So there's a recommendation that you have your sample points kind of ideally relatively close so that you're able to hit them all. So that there's a couple of competing principles. Random sampling is required. However, you also need to make sure that you don't do one sample in the morning and then you take all the way through to the afternoon to do the next one. So there are a couple of extra considerations there which might influence where they end up being in terms of geographical spread.
Thank you, Sammy. We have a lot of questions still, but I think we have answered a lot already, and there are a lot of answers by my colleagues on the chat. In the Q&A section, I think we can now close this section. So we hope you found this section valuable, walking you away, that you are walking away today with a good understanding of VM51. We encourage all projects proponents to explore the methodology further and take the advantage of these many features, including the upcoming digital version and the potential approved by ICVCM and Corsair. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any further question or would like any additional information. Thank you again for joining today's section. And we look forward to seeing how VM51 can contribute to a more sustainable and climate resilient future. Goodbye and good day, everyone.